Welcome, everybody, to the Oscar3DM podcast. Today, I have my friend Kaushik on for our second conversation. This time recorded because we had so much fun the first time around and found a lot of common ground in the field of computational design and the software projects that he's working on through a variety of positions with infrared.city and some work through Tapir. And, a bunch of personal projects here and there that I thought were fascinating as well. So I hope we get to touch on those. So I'm just going to open this up by asking you what drew you into the field of computational design and software development?
First of all, thank you, Oscar, for inviting me on this podcast. So, really a nice initiative because not a lot of people have access to information from professionals, and I see more people are also, previously it was all just blogs and tutorials. Now podcast is also becoming a thing, and it's good that this is also a new way of sharing information and experience. So coming back to the question, how it all started. So it's nothing special. It's the typical route of every architect. Uh, so I graduated in 2019. I did my bachelor's here in Chennai, in India. And so the first 1 year I was working at a few, like a firm and the typical story, AutoCAD drawings, SketchUp models. And
Mm-hmm.
then
Yeah, that's where I
it
started too.
was, yeah. So it's hard because while in the design studio you get exposed to so many experimental things, new ideas, the design process, the concept, but then when you graduate and come back to the reality, it's super different. And I felt like, okay, there must be a way to do things much more smarter or in a different way, like try to implement what we have learned or what we have tried to practice in the studios. And I came across Grasshopper. Actually, I come across Grasshopper when I was in my first year, like through a senior.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just, I think we were working on some competition, and he was showing me like how Rhino is the future. You have to learn this, you have to learn Grasshopper and everything. And I was pretty much hooked. And I kept in touch, but not so much. And after graduation, I thought, okay, maybe I should try this. Maybe I should give it a serious go. And that's where it started. So that's where it started more seriously, I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I hear a lot of parallels with my story as well because, AutoCAD and SketchUp is kind of where it starts. That's the beginner's toolkit, I feel like. AutoCAD has a long history in the industry just because it was as I understand it, one of the first widely implemented drafting tools, which kind of digitized everything and moved us from drafting, on paper. Maybe there was a few steps between, but I wasn't around for those. And then SketchUp obviously is a really user-friendly 3D platform, and it's one of the easier ones to get into. And I feel like it lends itself well to move into Rhino. At least that's the journey I took as well, because at some point SketchUp gets a little limiting in what you're able to do, and the designs you're able to express as you start to get into larger scale and trying to document things. So Rhino feels like a more grown-up version of that. I like you. I found Grasshopper in school, in this open, exciting environment where everyone's learning and trying to find new innovative ways to do things and excited about new technologies, whereas the professional world is more concerned about production and, maybe they don't want to move away from the older ways of doing things because at a certain point I feel like not everyone is disposed to being like this kind of lifelong learner. So was it how did you kind of highlighted the difference here between like the academic and the professional world. What opened your eyes to that? Did you have work experience while you were a student, and how was that transition for you going from academia to professional roles?
So actually, it's a funny story.
Yeah.
It also relates to your point you just said. So it was I was working in a couple of companies, three to be specific, during the course of my degree.
Hmm.
And during those internships is where I learned that, as you said, not everybody is like ready to move on to a different software or different workflow. But also it's fair from their side as well, because they have spent so much time in training and setting up their workflows, which is
Hmm.
like even if you take AutoCAD, like people have their own shortcuts, they have their own library of blocks and materials, and they're actually faster in that. But
Hmm.
for us, at least for me as a fresher, as a fresh graduate, or still in academia, because I didn't have like prior knowledge of these workflows, it was easy for me to transition completely to a new one, and which I
Yep.
thought was cool at that time.
Exactly.
So I think that was the first introduction for me of real life or professional life, as you say, because for me, I think the first software, the CAD software, which I learned was 3ds Max, but this was a little bit here and there. Like I was introduced to by one of my friends,
Okay.
and I was not very like serious about it because just the interface was daunting, and there's like so many buttons and so many different things to do, like modifiers, bending, what is this? So that was pretty hard. But Rhino made it a little bit easier to understand those concepts. Basically, it was simplified, or at least for me. And yeah, so I was pretty much used to, like conceptualizing in terms of Rhino, especially in terms of Grasshopper, because Grasshopper kind of breaks down the steps. Like if you want to draw a cylinder, it's like you have to select a point, you have to like like you have to visualize a circle and then like extrude it. So which means you have to give some length or direction. So it's like even something as basic as a cylinder is broken down into like subcomponents. So it's like easy. That's almost as if you draw it on paper, right? Like you draw a circle, you would instinctively, intuitively, you just position it on paper. But then in Rhino, it's much more explicit. You have to like select a point, and then you draw a circle. You just like draw two lines for extrusion. So
Yeah.
that was how it started.
Yeah.
And I was expecting like, okay, it's like something so simple and something so nice is in the market, and I thought like, okay, everybody will be using it, and yeah,
Because it's
but
the best way.
there
Everyone
was a
must be
difference.
using these tools to
Yeah.
their fullest potential, right? Which is a lesson that you learn is the world is a little further behind than you'd like it to be because in school you're kind of in this learning mindset already. You're like soaking everything up like a sponge and trying to find the best way to do things. So I feel like it's a good approach to stay a student throughout your life. And I call myself a lifelong learner time to time because I really feel like that. Like there's not a week that goes by without learning a new software concept or rendering concept or design concept. Um, but I want to circle back a little bit to your explanation of breaking these shapes down into their variables. Um, I
Mhm.
think I think it really gives you a good like design framework because you kind of understand the essence of all of the things that you're building. Because if you're building a circle, you realize that you have to have a point, a rate, and a radius. And if you're building a column, then you know that your variables are now four. It's the height and the diameter. Um, and then as you start to build buildings or designs, then you have a really intricate understandings of all of the mechanics of it. And I feel like you kind of understand it on a deeper level. At least that's the way I feel. And I feel like a lot of people who have this engineering or design mindset kind of have a similar feeling. So I don't know if that leads well into a question, but do you kind of agree with this assessment of um, design approach? Maybe a good question is when should you approach a design in a parametric uh, like frame of mind versus like an explicit one where you build it up step by step versus if you're prototyping, for example, you just take a stab at the final form. Like what is the happy balance between these two methods?
I think it depends on what you're trying to design, what your goal is,
Yeah.
and also at which stage of exploration you are, for example.
Yeah.
Because most of the time when you need to create something parametrics, it requires you to already know what are the parameters. For example, for a cylinder, you know that by default it's the radius and the height. But for more complex forms, you kind of have to like figure out the parameters while you design the framework, while you design the workflow. So not every design situation allows that. Maybe like you already know how the end product is going to be. For example, like if you're designing some mechanical system, uh, there's not much of room to like experiment parametrically, because a bolt is a bolt. You cannot change much there. But where you might like where you might explore, it could be the form, or maybe you're optimizing something, or maybe you have a like it depends on the which stage of design you are. If you're in the exploration stage and you already have like previous experience of something, then it's much easier to approach with the like a parametric approach.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've observed is, like when you jump into the parametric first, there's always some kind of redo.
Yes.
But when you do it the old fashioned way, and then you hit a point where you think, okay, maybe I should start automating it, and only that's when you start automating it.
I agree.
Because
Yeah,
there are
because
situations where you might like over engineer sometimes, because if it's just a box, it's way faster to just draw it statically. And even if you want to change it, you could just delete it, draw it again. But if it's much more complex, maybe parametric is one of the ways.
yeah, as I've tackled more projects and made the mistake of parametricizing too early, um, I've kind of found that rapid iteration, like if you're trying to go through design alternatives, what they called radicals in Design Studio, which is just create radically different designs of that achieve the goal that you're trying to achieve. Then it's better to just build something quick and dirty explicitly without parametric methods. But once you're maybe in an exploratory phase, but a little further down the line where you've locked down the variables and started to put in boundary conditions and constraints, and what the elements of the design, then you can start to assign parameters and then use those to further refine the design, and get it even further down the road. So I feel like it's like in some instances it's like a mid uh, design phase tool where you're still exploring the design, but you've settled on a few constraints. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. These constraints are basically the parameters.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have the first step is you have to identify what can be changed, because when you can literally design anything, you have to like put a box. You have to set a boundary, what can be changed, what are like hard boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
and then you play inside the box.
I agree. I agree. So your early days, you were using 3ds Max, which is like, is it a mesh tool? Because I've used Blender, but um, I'm
I
not.
would say it's pretty much similar. It's
Yeah,
mesh based.
that's kind of surprising that they used it for architectural applications, because I didn't think of like a tool like that, like a mesh based tool that maybe character artists or um, movie creators or these kinds of people, like those kinds of creatives, use has overlap with architecture. So that's interesting to hear. But I think I've seen it here and there.
The first time when I got introduced to 3ds Max, it was by a fabricator. So he was using it to create wooden models of staircases and balusters. So it
Mm,
was almost like carpentry and product design. And another thing is I've seen 3ds Max being used widely in the visualization industry, because I've heard it's pretty good with, I think there's a rendering engine called Corona.
mm.
And I think it goes well with 3ds Max. I've never tried it myself, but I've seen a lot of people in the architecture industry, at least here in India, use 3ds.
Oh well, that's interesting. So going back to your early career, coming out of school, what were your first roles, and what did that teach you about this field?
That's interesting. I worked in a company called Homelane. It was so this company is it's pretty interesting because the founder is a software developer, a former IT person,
Mm-hmm.
but he was in the interior design space, and he was trying to implement software principles and trying to like automate the design, the manufacturing process into one whole system, one vertical.
Mm.
And they had this in-house software which so there are two parts. One is they've extensively optimized their systems, their design. So they have this select SKUs, the products, which
Mm-hmm.
are, for example, like they've optimized the design in such a way that it's the perfect way to manufacture. So there's like less wastage, and it's easy to manufacture. They can mass produce it. They can assemble it. It's almost like IKEA, but let's say it's adapted to the Indian market,
Mm.
and it comes pre-assembled, so it's not like IKEA.
Maybe
And
I
that
missed
was
it, but what products do they design exactly?
so they're an interior service company,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working there as a designer, interior designer, basically.
Yeah.
So we had to use their inbuilt software, like their own software. It is called Spacecraft, which handled all the like you could design, but then you can use their own products. It's much like a configurator, let's say.
Mm.
It has the
Okay.
products which can be, uh, for example, if you want to design a cupboard or a wardrobe, let's say, you can pre-select from existing shutter materials or hinges, or like apply different textures, materials, different combinations of paneling. uh, you can modify the changes, thickness of plywood or something, and it kind of calculates the costing in real time, uh, and also like gives you the drawings a little bit. I think that was the first time as I was exposed to something like this, like
Yeah.
full scale automation, but in professional life. It was pretty good.
Yeah. So you walked into something that was already kind of built out before, and you did they hire you on as a user or as a developer of the tool?
I was a user of the tool because
Mm-hmm.
I was at this point I was not a programmer, I was not a developer,
Mm-hmm.
I was a designer. So this was fresh out of college,
Yeah.
and yeah, I was a designer. I was more like the user.
So did that kind of get the wheels turning for you? And wow, this is cool, and kind of want to build design tools like this.
Kind of, you could say that, because I worked there for 8 months, and then the pandemic hit, and so this was in a different city. So luckily, I just came back to my city just before the lockdown happened.
Mm-hmm.
So during the lockdown, that was the time I was, like trying to do something similar, but then I had like little bit knowledge of Grasshopper, a little bit of Python. So I was like trying to recreate something which I had experienced, furniture,
Mm-hmm.
but then on a smaller scale, because it's super hard to like design everything interiors.
Yeah.
So I started with some wardrobes and some wall paneling. I even released a plugin. It's called Seagrass,
Okay.
but don't look it up. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, the first things you make are never amazing, but
Yeah, but I was super proud. Like like
yeah, of
I
course.
think more than like 100 people downloaded it, and I was super happy that okay, somebody's happy.
Yeah.
Um, but then after a few months, I realized like okay, like maybe come on, man, I can do better. So I
Mm-hmm.
started. That's when things really kicked off, and I started programming, and like trying to identify real problems, not just plugins for the sake of plugins.
Yeah. So how did you go about identifying problems?
That's the hard part, if you ask
Yeah,
me. Like even
exactly.
now, it's the super hard because most of the time, something that you feel like it's the great idea and it's amazing, it's not really amazing. Maybe it is amazing for you, but not for everybody to make it profitable, to make like a business out of it, or or even a plugin out of it. So most of the times it was me surveying my friends, because all my friends are also fellow architects. They are
Hmm.
potentially my users, right?
Yeah.
So uh, most of the time I used to have like long discussions with them, trying to identify like. So this is where the experience from the internship comes, because I badly wanted to automate the drawings,
Hmm.
because that was hell. That
Yeah.
spending so much
That's a
time
rite of
during the
passage.
night.
Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, I was looking into like how to automate drawings, but then that's by itself is a huge rabbit hole. Um, but then like we could start somewhere small. So again, that's like I tried to connect the dots, and because I had some experience with the furniture company who is automating already, and there are also people in my circle who are designing furniture, so maybe somewhere I could use it. And
Hmm.
I would say that's where I got started, and I did a small plugin, as I mentioned. Like it was pretty small, man. Like,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's the, let's call it humble beginnings.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm kind of at the stage where I'd like to publish a small plugin with a couple tools just to get the um, experience of deploying a C# plugin to
Mm.
the Rhino ecosystem. So I think it's important. It's a step that everyone needs to take, and 100 people got use out of it. So I'm sure that you helped some people out there, and that's a great feeling. Is to help users at the end of the day do their job easier. At least that's what I like to do as well. And it seems like you do too. Um, why do you like this kind of work? Is it that gratification of helping other people? Is it solving problems? Like, what about this appeals to you?
Which one? You mean programming or in general computation design?
Um, I guess I lumped it all together, but it is a little different. Uh, let's focus on the plugins piece of it, like developing user tools. What about that is appealing to you?
I would compare it to an architect building buildings. Like, you know, when when you see something you designed, you ideated in your mind,
Hmm.
in real, and somebody's using it, that gives it just feels good, man.
Hmm.
Like, like some, and you feel like, okay, I have done something and it is actually useful. It's not one of those design redos. It's actually good, and it also helps you understand what works and what doesn't work, because ideating on the paper and actually executing it is super different.
Hmm.
And just as you said, like publishing the first plugin, it's, I think almost everybody should do it. Whoever is interested, they should do it, because why not, right?
Exactly.
And it also gives you the experience of, like publishing is just one part, and then comes, collecting the users, asking people to use it, to test it. Then if there are bugs, you have to solve it. So there's a whole lot. And before publishing, my, let's say my goal just stopped at publishing. And once I ticked that, it was like, okay, I'm done. What's next?
Hmm.
But that's actually when the work actually starts, because what I published worked for a very specific case which I was facing, but then different people, especially CNC manufacturers, they wanted something different, like some tolerances, their curved fillets, and that was something I never even imagined, and I didn't know basically. And I think that's the part where you start learning. So basically, it's more like project based learning, and you get to put yourself out there.
I'm
And
a big believer in that.
uh, yeah, that's kind of the best way to learn.
Yeah, building something is absolutely the best way to learn because before that it's just theory and you don't know. You can get like a map of the land, but you don't know what the trees look like until you're actually down there and you solve the bugs
Nice.
and the little problems, and you stay up late on the forums and trying to understand what you're doing wrong. It's really interesting this bit you say about marketing and about community building after releasing the product, because it's a step that you don't even imagine that's going to come up until after you have real users. And some people tell you it's almost right, like I like these bits of it but I can't use it because I don't have these features. And it kind of
Mm.
builds your understanding of how people want to use your tool and kind of allows you to pivot. So not pivot, but maybe build the feature set or refine who your audience is. um,
Mm.
I think it's a really interesting part of this whole process.
Yeah, I would also say pivot because sometimes things maybe it's like, so for I can give you an example. Like the first time when I built something and released it, after a few months, it kind of became like a default feature in Rhino.
Mm.
So sometimes you have to, and now I cannot sell this, or okay, forget selling. Now I cannot even get users to like download the plugin because now it's a
Hmm.
default thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's also pivot, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so if you want to keep going down your career trajectory, what was next for you after you developed your first plugin and got that first validation from users and started to try to find new problems to solve?
I actually didn't get validation from the users.
You had
Yeah,
100 downloads.
I had 100 downloads, but I learned how to take criticism.
That's funny. That's another lesson.
Yeah, the first time it was like I was shocked, and then okay, okay, so let's
Mhm.
see what can be done. And I think it's a journey. It's good that people are able to give you criticism, whether good or bad, and because in the end, the market always says the truth, right? Like if something is just a plugin for the sake of plugin, it doesn't do anything, then there's no need for it. I mean, for me, it was a need to publish it, but for the user, to somebody to actually download it, to take the time to test it out, and then it doesn't work, it's kind of frustrating because we don't know in what situation they are trying to solve it. They might be in a deadline, or they might be,
Mhm.
trying to do something important. And so I understand. But it's good that people even take the time to, criticize. That's getting user feedback is very important, and it's very hard. I'm lucky I got that feedback early on.
Yeah. That's a good lesson to take because it'll allow you to take that and to make it something productive. It'll
Yeah,
also allow you to build some thicker skin because people aren't always nice about their feedback, I'm sure.
yeah, and for good reason.
Yeah,
You
it's
cannot deliver a shitty product and expect sugary words,
well,
right?
it's funny because you're trying to help people, and there's it's something that literally didn't exist before. So it's funny uh, that they get upset, but I do understand this element of wasted time because we've all been under a deadline, and a lot of times I'm trying to do something new. So I'm like, okay, what can help me do this? And you go down the YouTube rabbit hole and research the tools available, and then kind of commit to one and spend maybe a couple hours trying to get it up and running and trying to integrate it into your work. And if it doesn't work, then that's always discouraging.
Yeah, it's frustrating actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I just went through this with Stable Diffusion because it's this AI tool which allows you to do AI renderings, and I was seeing all these beautiful um, images online. What I realized is they generate about 100 of them and then pick the best one. You know what I mean? It's like,
Mm,
um, and the the workflows are so specialized because if you want to fix hands, then that's one model and one process. If you want to fix faces, that's another. If you want, like, there's different um, AI models for different purposes, and some are better than others, and with their own like settings, and so it ended up being this weeks long rabbit hole for something I thought would take like a day. um,
I would call the situation crippled by your choices.
this is true. This It's crippled by parameters and choices and just all the shiny objects. It's like that meme of the guy walking down the street and looking at the girl behind. um, but it's funny. So I guess I do understand the frustration, and at the same time, you know. So what was next for you?
So this plugin happened, and then I was freelancing a little bit, trying to do. It was pretty random. I was doing a little bit of architecture, a little bit of construction, a little bit of trying to use parametric design somewhere, but unsuccessful. And then this happened. I got the first job. So actually, this company, Hulscher,
Mm,
they're based in Germany, and they were looking for someone to do exactly what I was doing, trying to automate,
hmm.
except it wasn't furniture, it was building facade.
Okay.
It was an entirely different scale, but they liked my previous work, the plugin, and it was a good match. Like based on the team size, I think they had a parent company, and this was like a new department they were trying out, and I was one of the first external hires.
Mm,
And since it was also a remote opportunity, and yeah, because of the pandemic, it was pretty good. Like this went on for 3 years. Wow. Okay, 3 years.
yeah.
That's a long time.
What was the company's name? Horscher.
Holscher, Holschcher.
Oh, Horscher. Okay. So that was a 3 year remote opportunity. How was the difference in working in office? I presume for your previous internships and your position with in freelancing. Well, freelancing was
Mm.
also remote, I imagine. So I'm just trying to get at the
Mm.
dynamic between being in person and remote and how that's worked out for you.
Okay, so the internships were all in person. The first automation exposure, home lane, that was also in person.
Mm-hmm.
It was also a client-facing role, so it was in person, obviously. And the plugin, the freelancing was also in person.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the plugin developing the plugin was, of course, remote. It's computer-based, but then like I was still meeting architects and my fellow batchmates to like try to get them use it to get some feedback. So that was both, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the first time I was introduced to the idea of remote working, like working through the computer completely. It
Yeah.
was pretty much fun. Yeah.
Are you a good learner
And
on your own? Were you able to integrate well with the team?
I actually prefer learning on my own, as a
Uh-huh.
matter of fact, because sometimes structure is good, like structured course is good when you're searching for something. But most of the time, how I learn is it's project based learning. So I learn based on what I need at that time. So it's easier for me to like search more than videos. Text is easier because we can search through it, we can filter it out, and get to the specific parts.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's good. I mean, you have to keep learning in this field or any field for that matter.
That's
The
true.
more you
And
learn, the more you know that you don't know anything.
that's true. There's only so many things you can absorb what during your time here, and
Mm.
it's so the knowledge is so infinite, and you can go so deep into any domain. I feel like um, this approach of being a generalist and learning on the project is really valuable because it makes you versatile and it gives you kind of a view of how all of these pieces fit together and what tools you need to reach for and when. Um, and I think it's really admirable because I take the same approach. I feel like, and the skills that you need to learn are so varied that even if you were in person, there's not an expert in all of the pieces that you need to reach for. So it does pay
Mm.
to learn on your own.
Yeah, I think I like what you said, like being a generalist doesn't mean you're not tied to any one thing. It
Hmm.
just means you know a little bit of everything, just enough to get the work done.
Hmm.
And the important part is you're ready to learn if the need arises.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's well
And
put.
yeah, and one of the important things to learn is to learn how to learn, because not there's no one fit. solution for everybody. Some people prefer videos, some people prefer audio content, some people like to read books, some people like to read uh, books, but not physical books, like digital books. So it depends how you learn, how you retain information. Um, I also maintain like a personal. Do you know Zettel Custom?
I don't.
Okay, so it's okay. Right now, it's super hyped and popularized, but it's
Hmm.
very simple. It's a system to take notes, to keep information in check.
Mm.
So it's indexable. You can search it. So basically, I just maintain a repository where I just put in all the information. It's super random. It's suddenly about anime, then it's about
Hmm.
food, then it's about philosophy, then it's about some new idea for a project. So everything is just there, and it helps me, like to connect, to get ideas from different places. Like especially when you're like trying to be a generalist, like it's nice to draw conclusions, draw ideas from seemingly different things.
That makes sense. Are these all notes that you've written yourself?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's more like one like a couple of few lines, maybe from a video, like something I found interesting, or
Mm.
something like a bookmark.
Can you give it like a title?
Yeah,
It,
it's like title. It has a timestamp. It yeah, like I've kind of like changed the format so many times, and
hmm.
like finally arrived at something that works for me.
Yeah.
Initially, it was not so structured, but now I'm just making it more structured because I also use a little bit of Python scripts to, like search, find, and link them, backlink them. So those kind of things. I'm also learning. It's also like a project which I might do for a couple of decades, I think.
Yeah. It'll be able to centralize all the knowledge that you learn throughout, life. I think it's really cool. It'll end up being your own personal second brain, I guess, or
Yeah,
dictionary.
that's how I started, but right now it's not like a second brain. It's like it's more like a, I don't know what to call it. It's the prototype of everything. Suddenly it's my home server. Suddenly it's my Wikipedia. Suddenly it's like a recipe book where I refer to my previous recipes, something. So
Oh,
it
okay.
can be like anything.
I really enjoy that. I'm using Notion right now. I don't have a very good system, but I have a page called Learning Notes, and I have all
Hmm.
of the topics that I have, and then you nest in there, and then it has all the things that I thought were interesting to note down about those. I'm not very consistent about it, except for when I'm initially exploring down a topic, I'll start to aggregate everything in there. And then, or if it's something that I go back to really often, code snippets, stuff like that, I'll like,
Hmm.
go back to my learning page. So I think it's really valuable. I think everyone should have some kind of note taking system like that, especially if you're the type of person that likes to learn like you and I do.
Hmm. I think most of the time we refer to the same things. It's just sometimes it's doesn't stay there. You just have to like refer to it again. You just know what it is, but you don't know how it is exactly. So it helps.
That's funny. It's because I don't know if I use it as a crutch too much, because if you have it in a second place, you don't need to commit it to memory. So then it's like, oh, it'll always be there, uh, which is okay. But then I have to look up the same thing every day, and I'm like, this one I should really just have memorized. Like, um, I think they say that happens with people in relationships too, where if you're with someone, they end up being your second source of knowledge for some things, and people tend
Mm.
to lean on that and reduce their own cognitive load, I guess. So I think it's funny. It's kind of a form of that. It's your companion that'll never leave for the
Yeah,
next few
that's also one of
decades.
my nightmares to forget. Like, the more I fill up the second brain, I feel like I'm emptying my first one.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you're just making more space. That's okay. um, well, that's neat. So we were on the topic of working remotely and learning, and
Yeah.
um, so did you continue that journey of working basically in your own space, learning on your own accord, or how did your career continue to develop after that point with your time with Holscher?
For sure. Yeah. I think it was the best experience I could get at that point because the team was small. We were just starting out with 4 people, and it's an amazing team. Those guys are the best. Yes, I'm still in contact with them, and
Mm-hmm.
they're the best. So all of us were like pseudo programmers. Like everybody's an architect, nobody's a programmer yet, but we all know little bits of, like a little bit of Python, a little bit of something. We can get a job done. So it's like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first year, we were trying to do everything through Grasshopper, and then we hit a point where we understood, okay, it's uh, we need more power. We have to like switch to programming, and that's when I knew Python before that, just as a syntax, like the theoretical part, not the actual execution part of it. Like
Mm-hmm.
creating the proper code base, learning about developer principles, and like structuring the code, especially Git and
Mm-hmm.
all the Git commands. So that was the time when I learned um, hands-on. That was the you could say those 2 years. After the first year, those 2 years were the golden years because my rate of learning new information shot up exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
I was constantly learning, like it was different languages, different data structures, different like concepts, getting exposed to different plugins. And that's also when I fell in love with math. And that is also something I would like to pursue on a later stage, maybe when I get the time. So that's kind of those 2 years is kind of when I like started to transition from a Grasshopper user into a programmer.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we released the software, it was not exactly like a plugin. It was more like a cloud software plus desktop software, which just like talks to each other. And we released it internally, got some feedback about how it's not working, how it's making everybody's life harder than it's supposed to be.
More criticism.
So yeah, because the construction team, the design team, are also super used to AutoCAD, Athena, and their own workflows. And us, the shiny new team coming there and introducing Rhino, Grasshopper, the spaghetti web of everything,
Mm-hmm.
just like didn't work out initially. So we pivoted actually. We stopped using like Grasshopper completely and switched to Rhino because at least the CAD interface is a little bit similar.
Mm-hmm.
And with buttons, you don't have to like type in commands. And that's kind of how it was hard because um, we were not just programmers, we were also trainers, we were also teachers, we were also the like when nothing works, we still have to become the design team. Like we still have to work with AutoCAD and the original tools which they had. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to like shut off Grasshopper or programming completely and become traditional architects sometimes. So that was nice because it helped me develop that like flexibility, let's say.
Mm. Yeah. So was the development team also involved in the day-to-day design um, of the projects they were working on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Initially, we were not, but we understood that without understanding the problems firsthand, it was hard to develop because we are developing in our own bubble. And when we released it the first time, we understood, okay, this is not working out because the intended audience are different from what we imagined.
I feel like you and I have lived a mirror of the same events because I I had this exact same thing happen where you develop in isolation and you release it and then it doesn't work and then you have to integrate with the day-to-day design and then you rebuild what you thought you wanted and it takes a whole different form than it originally did
Mhm.
because now you have context of of what of what they need, which is why now I believe in implementation as fast as possible so that you can start to stress test your theories um, before
Yeah.
you get too far into building the holy grail of a tool that no one is ever going to use because it actually doesn't work.
Mm.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unfinished projects in my GitHub account. It's just all hidden away because mostly it starts with an idea, and I think, okay, let's jump into the code, and then by the time I'm almost like in midway, I understand, okay, this is not going to work, and I know, okay, the start was wrong. I jumped into the code too soon before
hmm
collecting more information. So usually these days, programming is the last step for me.
mm
And it also helps that I'm a little bit comfortable with programming and also like learning more programming, because once you learn one language, the other languages are very similar, just the syntax is different.
hmm
And so yeah, the programming almost always comes in the end for me these days.
I see.
First it's information collection.
So, what does the information collection look like for you on a project?
So I could give you an example actually. So the current company I'm working with, infrared.city,
hmm
the task which I'm focusing on right now is building connectors for different CAD applications. Basically, we have like plugins for Grasshopper, Revit, Rhino. We're also like planning to do much more.
hmm
Um, so before jumping, if it was the previous me, I would jump right away into developing the plugin, making the components for Grasshopper, making the beautiful icons, and like making it look shiny
hmm
even before we have fun. So what happens is usually the functionality changes based on the requirement. So these days it's more like like trying to freeze the requirement, or at least phase it out, so that like in this version these are the requirements, so we plan for these features in this timeline. And if there are any more requirements, we'll like put it on the timeline so that it's predictable. And I also like question why we need certain features, what is the problem they're trying to solve. So it gives me much more idea if there's something very specific to one plugin, or if it can be like tackled on all the plugins. Is it common, or is it something specific? And also like if there's a requirement, is it specific to one user, or how many people find this problem common?
hmm
So these kind of questions, because every time is money basically, and every time you put in to develop something is, and if it doesn't work out, it's going to cost.
Yeah. So the planning needs to be um, done well so that you spend your time well and you don't burn money and it actually results in something that people are going to use and that people are asking for beyond maybe
I think
just
the
one
first step
complaint.
is
Yeah.
I think the first step is to be able to release it, to get it to the first set of audience,
Mm.
to actually test it. And even in that, there are certain things like, so there are certain things which I've already automated due to my experience in building plugins, building tools. So one of the first things I usually do is set up workflows, like on GitHub, for example. Like when you push code, you automatically build the plugin and push it to Yak, or
Mm.
like what is it called, Foot for Rhino. So those kind of workflows, some unit testing. So these are things which I've learned along the way. Uh, Test-driven development, behavior-driven development, all these things. So these are some templates, let's say, some workflows which have worked for me. And these are like, when I'm starting to code, these are the first things I do, like set up the framework so
Yeah.
that when I make a mistake, which everybody does, and I definitely do, it gets caught before it goes to production. So
Okay.
that's where the tests come in.
Yeah. Tests. Okay.
So, and much more time, like I usually spend more time like trying to understand the problem, trying to abstract it, and see like what can be used, what works, what doesn't work. uh, yeah, ironically, the more I program, I feel like the less I should program.
Mm. Okay. Can you explain that?
I think most of the times, like everybody's trying to build similar things, but in different contexts. And that's also the reason why I started contributing to open source projects, because you have like one package which you can reuse in multiple places. It's not
Mm.
locked down inside a commercial company or like a data silo. And when it's reusing, it's easier to maintain because you don't have to update in 3 4 different places. It's just one place.
Yep.
And when it's open, you're not the only person who has access to the code, so anybody can fix it. Like if somebody leaves the company or changes the company, or if somebody's unavailable, they're on vacation, it's easier to just get a freelancer or get somebody else to take a look. And if it's popular enough, there are already existing forks of it, so there's already community going on.
Hmm.
So it's beneficial for everybody, provided that the problem you're trying to solve is validated. But then it's super good to be open source anyway.
So, what kind of open source projects have you worked on that have allowed you to leverage them again in other projects?
Personally, not many,
Hmm.
because I've used other people's open source projects.
Yeah.
Uh, the ones which I worked on, I've used it in my own projects basically. Like instead of creating the same package or same code base in different projects, I try to just push it as a package on PyPy or NuGet and then reuse it myself. It's a little bit easier for me as well because it's one code base.
Yeah.
Um, but I think if you think about it, for Python and JavaScript, everything is open. That's why there's so much uh, of community and so much of usage of everything.
Hmm.
And that's a good thing, right? Like the more people use it, the more validation or more criticism, something. But you make progress, you refine it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The community is a big, just as far as learning and ensuring that people don't solve the same problems over and over again, which is an interesting balance because at the end of the day, we have to build tools for companies, and a lot of times those companies see it as a competitive advantage, um, or they've invested in those resources, so they don't necessarily want to share them. Um, so open source where possible, I think, is a good approach. Um,
I agree.
so you're on the Tapir team, which I wanted to touch on a little bit. They are building an open source API for AutoCAD to interface with AutoCAD C++ library. Is that right?
So the one of the differences because I'm coming from C Sharp and Rhino environment,
Hmm.
ArchiCAD is built on primarily uses C++. I
Yeah.
think Rhino also uses C++, but the public API is in C Sharp.net. Uh, so what Tapir is doing is basically it opens up the connection from outside of ArchiCAD.
Hmm.
And because the SDK or the original application is built in C++, it's like we have to develop two components. One is the component which is like an add-in or a plugin to ArchiCAD itself, which has to be written in C++, and that executes the command. But then you can send the commands from outside ArchiCAD.
Hmm.
That's where the Python component comes in. So basically, what we're doing is we are building a C++ library as well as a Python library that can talk to each other,
Yeah.
and that opens up a lot of possibilities because once it's Python, it's you can run it on your console, you can run it on your inside Grasshopper or any other application. You can also have like a user interface, a GUI application outside ArchiCAD.
Hmm.
So, and because it's Python, so we actually chose Python because it's much more easier for others to start adopting it, to develop it. And also most of the people in the ArchiCAD community prefer Python over other languages. Like for them, the other option is C++. So Python is easier
Yeah,
for me.
but between the two, Python is much more manageable to deal
Yep.
with. Yeah, that makes sense, and it's also the first language that I feel like informal developers or self-taught developers learn. It was the first one in your journey
Mm,
and the first one in mine. And people learning Grasshopper, I think that's the logical next step. So if you open it up at the, uh, I guess the widest common denominator, then that's the where I think it'll get the most use.
yep.
Yeah.
True.
Um,
One more thing is Graphisoft already has something similar set up. They have a Python API, which is very similar to what
mhm.
Tapir is doing. But the thing is, like, it's kind of limited, and we had a discussion with them, and it seems they're not yet in the space to develop it further. So that's where the community comes in. I think Jorge started it, and at that time, I was also like kind of looking for something more open to do it, because as a programmer, you don't have much beautiful things to show. It's mostly lines of code, and previously as an architect, you have a portfolio, you have some rendering, you have some fancy forms, and
Mhm.
then switching to a programmer, it's like, what do I show? Should I print out the code of 1,000 lines of code and show them? So that's when I started looking at, like, contributing for something that is open, that is public. It also gives me like a nice place to, like, practice my skills, but then also be more useful. Like, somebody can already use it, and that's also the advantage of joining someone else's project instead of starting your own. Because if you start your own, then you have to manage the programming, you have to manage the marketing, getting the users, running the community. Here, Jorge was taking care of everything.
Mhm.
Basically, he was the user, and he since he's running his company already, it's Enzyme APD in Hong Kong, because they use ArchiCAD a lot. They were already my users if I were to develop it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you
So
basically walk into an ecosystem that's already been
yeah,
built out for you.
yep, yeah.
Um, yeah. I mean, there's merits to building yourself, and there's a lot to integrating into a team, and you can do both throughout your career. So I feel like trying both ways is good depending on what your ambitions are.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, I was starting to get a little bit of real world experience in programming,
Hmm.
and that was a good start for me because the environment was already set up and managed, and I can focus on what I do best, the programming part.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely. I agree because if you build your own product, like you said, you have all these other disciplines and all these other tasks, and your programming time all of a sudden gets cut down. Whereas if that's what your passion is or what you actually want to work on, then being integrating into a larger team is smarter move for sure.
yeah,
Um,
actually, it's the other way around. Usually, the programming time doesn't get cut. I can code for days, but then it's the marketing part that gets cut. That's why
mhm.
there's a lot of hidden projects which never gets released or
I
never
see.
sees the light.
Yeah, they need to be packaged and introduced and marketed, and it all comes back to marketing. It's kind of
Yep.
an interesting problem because if you want to build anything, whether that's a company or product or anything for yourself, you'll end up running against this final boss, which is
That's the most.
yeah, which is a incredibly hard discipline in itself. Uh, as difficult as programming, which is getting buy-in from the world.
True, 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 very true.
Yeah, so obviously you and I we did a lot of our learning on the job, kind of adopted these design tools as we heard about them, just um, because of the passion for learning and also the passion for doing things in a better way. What would you say to someone who is interested in computational design, has heard about tools like Grasshopper, um, kind of is interested into entering this realm of uh, parametric computational design? How would you even start, and what advice would you give them?
I think the most important part is to be curious, because once you're curious about what is happening in the field, or how somebody is doing something, or why somebody is doing something the way they are doing, it opens up a lot of more questions, and you can think about maybe there's a better way, or maybe this is already the better way. So that's curiosity is the first part. And I think it also, your journey also might depend on where you're from. Personally, I was like introduced to programming before architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I was always looking at where can I implement the skills which I've already learned. Like even after graduation from architecture, I was still trying to look into a space where you can, where I can like deploy the design skills as well as the programming skills, and that's kind of how I found this place. So it depends, but then I think right now the field is also like super big, as in computational design itself is an umbrella term, and there is like so many subfields. So if you're curious enough, I think it's, you should try everything. It's like a buffet. You have to taste something first before you decide whether you like it or not, and then you double down. But the important part is to keep an open mind and try everything, because it depends. Like for certain people, certain things are natural likingness. For me, it was programming, but for all, but also for me, like I'm still figuring out AI. It's the theoretical part is fine, but actually implementing is super hard, at least for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be like something different for you, but the important part is to keep trying.
Yeah. So I'm hearing curiosity and try as much as you can until you figure out the pieces that you actually like, and see where that takes you. Whether that's AI computational methods, um, or it's not even this field at all. Maybe you try a different intersection of things and end up at a different place. But the important part is curiosity, I think, at the end of the day. Yeah. I think that's good advice. If